This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so this is a workshop in docket 23 or 2220 rule, 23-2220 rule. I'm Riley Allen. I'm a commissioner with the Public Utility Commission. I'm tasked with leading an effort to develop an economic impact analysis of the clean heat standard that's required under Act 18. There are certain staff members from the commission that are available and participating in this. So we have Aaron Hicks-Tibbles and Tom Nauer are currently online. Jacob Davis, I believe, is going to be joining at some point. I don't see anyone else that is associated with the commission. The purpose of the workshop is to help create a roadmap to creating a useful model necessary to estimate the economic impacts of the clean heat standard. As I indicated, if you're coming in late, I ask if you do plan to participate to keep your camera on. My goal for the workshop is to create some preliminary steps or a path to developing the model or the tools that are necessary for us to create that clean heat standard. What I plan to do is go through a list of or a series of questions that I have and let people kind of react to them. I'm also going to invite others to essentially identify any questions that they think they would like to raise or that we should be discussing at this point in time. I plan to conclude this workshop with some semblance of a plan going forward. I'll give people a chance to provide any follow-on comments that occur to them after the workshop that on issues that weren't raised, and I'll then create some semblance of a scheduling order or plan going forward. We have a relatively short window of time available to perform this analysis. I think we're all kind of aware of the challenges and the short window that we have. We have the advantage of good work that has been done by others, and there were certain models that were referenced in the notice that went out, but the department has created one, and Energy Futures Group, along with their partners, have created a tool or model that is out there that we can potentially discuss and figure out whether and how we can leverage those tools. The commission is working with its consultant, Opinion Dynamics. Opinion Dynamics is going to be helping with the modeling effort. Their role is not so much in the creation of the model, but really working to ensure that the modeling framework that we create meets certain objectives for transparency and accessibility and usability. So they're there to help ensure that we have a transparent tool, ideally one that has reasonably well vetted assumptions, and at least we know the sources for the assumptions that are being used, and so on. So I'll pause there and just see if anyone has any preliminary thoughts or questions before I run through my list of questions. So I'll start with the workshop process. So I estimate we have about 7 weeks available. I'd like to have essentially a completed effort by roughly the first week of December. I think that'll give us time to kind of use the modeling tool to come up with a range of estimates what the What has been asked of us in the legislation is to come up with impacts on customer rates and fuel bills, impacts on participating and non-participating customers, net impacts on total spending on energy for the thermal sector and uses, estimates of fossil fuel reductions, and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And we have been asked to produce that and provide high, medium, and low estimates of costs. So that's the task before us. And, the threshold question for me is, how should we use the 7 weeks? What is the kind of best path? How much of it should be in open workshops like this? How much should be through essentially the labor of individuals that are putting in time to help us create this model behind the scenes? Should there be paper filings along the way? Are there any thoughts on how we kind of proceed efficiently, but as best we can, transparently, given the short space of time? Jared.
Thank you, Commissioner Allen. One thought that I have is I think it would be really helpful if before any model runs are generated, there is at least an opportunity to have a workshop where the basic kind of parameters, inputs, and assumptions can be discussed. I think that I've been a part of other processes, either directly or as a commenter, where that step isn't taken, and then the assumptions and inputs need to be revised, and I think it leads to an inefficient process. And given the short amount of time of the 7 weeks, I think before coming up with ranges and estimates and doing model runs, it would be great to have the opportunity to have eyes on and open discussion about appropriate assumptions and inputs.
Thanks, Jared. I think that's a very helpful suggestion. I'll take that and come back to that. TJ, do you have a comment?
Yeah, you mentioned written filings. I think that would be helpful. I think what Mr. Duvall suggested isn't a bad thing. Having some discussion over the inputs and assumptions before there are results to react to, I think is a better process, so that people aren't just reacting to the results and that they're thinking about the actual inputs going in. And I think that could be helpful. I do think having some, when we get to that point and we can figure out what the timing is, having some written filings for the commission to consider will be really helpful. People can just say things off the cuff in workshops, and it is, I think that makes it harder for the commission to adjudicate and really fully consider comments. I think it's important to have the opportunity for people to say things off the cuff, or particularly if the public wants to participate at all, to kind of highlight the types of issues that the commission might want to address. But once we get into specific assumptions, I think it could be useful to have some more formal context for the commission to go off of.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. You're essentially confirming your interest in what Jared had suggested, and you're suggesting that if we do have essentially a workshop that is online, that be followed with some opportunity to provide written comment to enable the commission to more fully consider and adjudicate or deliberate on those comments.
Yes, yeah, and I'm not sure the timing, if it should be workshop filing, or just workshop filing. I'm curious what others think of that as well.
Okay, I'll leave that for others to respond to. Mr. Weston.
I like where TJ and Jared are going with this, and you, Commissioner. But I think some folks might find it helpful to have something to react to, some idea up front as to, what kinds of, well, you've already said, of course, what the analysis has to, develop, but some initial sets of assumptions and inputs in some way or another, even in the most rudimentary form, might help frame a workshop discussion.
I think that's also very helpful. I do, kind of worry about, the challenge of kind of responding to all of the assumptions at once, or providing essentially too much information for people to, effectively respond to, which, calls out the question, is there a way of essentially narrowing or, identifying the most important variables, or, coming to some measure, or do we have to essentially have the model and all the assumptions out there for people to react to before we can go through this, potentially iterative process that Jared and TJ have alluded to. TJ?
So I think there could be something that strikes the middle of that, and what I think might be helpful, Alec and I think would be prepared to kind of talk a little bit today about the types of very key variables and scenarios that might be useful to model to help create that range and get some feedback today. And then in that case, there would be some, and then folks could react live here and maybe with the filing, and then we could have a workshop to talk about those types of things, like, what are the variables that are most important to stress? What are the scenarios that we want to make sure that we see? And then we could have kick off the process with that. I think we have some ideas there that we're hopeful that we'd be able to share today, and just, to put it out there and further into the process, just to really get feedback on.
Okay, so we'll come back to that. I want to hear from others. Tristan Brown.
So one thought is to conduct a sensitivity analysis where you simply vary each of the main parameters plus or minus 30%. You'll pretty quickly identify there's going to be many parameters that really don't have much of an impact. Other parameters are going to have a very important impact, and so then you can essentially down select to the most important parameters and then focus the attention on identifying the appropriate variables for those. So especially in the time constraints, rather than opening everything up and taking input on every single parameter, focus on those that sensitivity analysis identifies as having the biggest impacts.
Okay, that sounds constructive. Others? Tristan, do you want to de-raise your hand, or do you have further comments? Okay. I think, some sort of sensitivity on variables makes sense. I do think that, just kind of applying a 30% adjustment to everything may not make sense. There's some variables that, you just have higher confidence that, the numbers don't have to vary that widely. I'm not sure who makes those judgments, but I think that's, something we can discuss at a later point. But I appreciate the suggestion. I think a sensitivity and using a default of 20 to 30% on variables seems sensible. So Jared, you have your mic on, but I don't know if that's for a reason or
I had just left it on. My apologies.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, unless there are further comments, TJ, it might be a good time for you to just kind of pivot toward what you wanted to share and start getting some reactions.
Sure, and I'm going to turn it over to Alec Anzac as well here, who, if folks don't know, he's a director of efficiency and energy resources here at the Department of Public Service. And I think probably we'll want to start with just talking about kind of the, what's out there, just to level set with the NV5 model and the EFG model that is out there. Folks may remember who have been involved in this process, Energy Futures Group, EFG, I refer to them as, did a analysis for the state about a year and a half ago. And NV5 did the potential study for the Department of Public Service. And so there's kind of two models out there. And Alex, really, you've been really in the weeds. So I just wanted to tee that up, and you could talk about those models maybe a little and what we're thinking.
Yeah, sure. And I guess before I do that, I do have at least one or two slides just to help kind of ground this in a visual. Riley, can you make me the presenter just so I can throw that up on the screen?
I can sure try.
Oh, something's happening. It's just showing you the whole thing. So I guess you get to see the guts of it too. But so yeah, as TJ said, we've been working on an economic model. I think part of the goal here was to try to continue the conversation from the NV5 potential study, and so I think we got a high level look at what a clean heat standard might look like under sort of a market optimized scenario, which, while helpful to determine whether or not it, the potential, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I just got some feedback there. Sorry.
I believe there's someone on the phone call that I'm picking up the feedback too, Alec. If the person who's calling in could mute themselves, it might help.
Can I just? Okay, that's better. Sorry about that. So yeah, I think the NV5 study was helpful in sort of setting the general scope around the issue to determine whether or not the potential existed. I think we've exhausted a lot of conversation on the general perceptions of that study, and so we wanted to try to continue that conversation, as we said, and kind of drill down a little bit further and look at more of the, I guess, reality of what happens in Vermont and how the measures and mix of low carbon intensity fuels might come together in a more realistic, shall we say, set of scenarios. And so taking a lot of the sort of groundwork that was laid in the NV5 study, we decided that we would set out and build a model more from the bottom up, using real data from the EEUs and from the DU programs, OEOs, weatherization programs, looking at actual fuel sales, that kind of thing, rather than the top-down view that NV5 used in their initial pass. So to do that, we went back to the EFG pathways model, which I think both models sort of work, generally speaking, in the same way. They're both kind of big NPV calculators. But we felt that the EFG model was just, when it really came down to it, it lent itself better to a rework. It was more accessible and manipulatable, if that's a word, given the short timeline and the still large amount of work left to do. So with that said, I think we've taken a first pass at kind of getting that real data in there, kind of building up that framework and getting the model to work in the way that we need it to. And now we've got to the point where it's time to start, putting in the toggles and the business as usual scenarios and building up sort of the different building blocks of how we think we would approach harvesting the credits needed to meet GWSA targets and what that would actually look like. Again, using sort of the reality of the situation on the ground in Vermont. So with that said, I will jump into kind of, I think, the discussion that's been teed up here. I don't know that I'm not sure if we want to talk about real numbers. Maybe I'll hand it back to Riley at that point if we do. But certainly from a higher level, just talking about categories of the types of variables that we think we still have the ability to manipulate, with sliders or toggles or however you want to visualize that. But we've come up with sort of four key categories of variables. I think obviously the incentive levels that would be available to move these measures into the market are important. How much cost coverage is going to be borne by the sale of the credits versus how much cost coverage is going to be borne by individual customers to get these technologies and liquid fuels in the market. The measure characterizations themselves, I think, not to say that the TRM is not, the gold standard for all of this, but certainly the way that measures were put together in the NV5 model as compared to how they actually materialize in the market is quite different. Again, because of that the economically efficient loading of measures, you often had quite a bit of distance between measures that would normally appear together as part of projects, particularly with the installed measures, weatherization, fuel switching. There is cost disparity between air sealing and blowing in cellulose, for example, and those might have appeared in different places on the timeline in the NV5 model. And in the reality, those are going to be delivered together. There's no customer that I'm aware of that's going to let you rip their siding off and then come back 5 years later and rip it off again so that you can, put in some other measure. So I'm trying to get at more of this sort of reality-based approach. So there's some differentiation. Again, the measure characterizations that underlie all this stuff obviously have not changed, but the way that the measures are packaged together will look, it's a little bit different, and there's some opportunity to have a conversation about what that really looks like. We have some ideas, but we're perfectly open there. The third thing is the liquid fuels component. I think the one thing I would speak very highly of in the NV5 analysis in terms of representing reality is the liquid fuels analysis that they provided, which was I think C3 may have done. In any case, it's a pretty exhaustive look. They quantified both obviously the CI scores through time, but they also quantified sort of the market potential, I think, based on the fuel availability, if you will, in certain thresholds. So certainly being able to incorporate that will help put upper bounds on how much of the credit market can be made up by liquid fuels in any given year. And again, I think there is some ability to manipulate that, to look at different scenarios. We can talk about that in a second, but we feel that that's another key variable. And then the administrative cost portion, which I think is at this point probably the biggest X factor in our minds. There is not a good example in the world of this type of approach being implemented yet, and so I think there is room for a healthy discussion on what the benchmarks for administrative costs look like, particularly on things like credit verification, IT platform, licensing and support, all that kind of thing. Those are still very much undetermined. So I'll stop there. Any questions on the variables component or suggestions for us, things to include?
Alec, do you, in the administrative cost, where would you put the trading platform? Where does that kind of
I
fall?
think very much so that lives in the administrative cost piece. I don't know that there's an equitable way to break that up and kind of assign different portions of it to, whether that's user licenses or ongoing support. Certainly the construction of the platform itself would probably be a significant expense. I think that all has to live in the administrative cost portion.
Thanks, Alec. It looks like David Westman has a question or comment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and thanks to Alec and TJ for advancing some steps out of the threshold here. It's really helpful to have I think the point Rick was or TJ was making, someone made it. It's often easier to respond to things than to come up with them afresh. So thank you for doing some fresh thinking. I think the topic that we've been really trying to understand in terms of what the cost is that actual incentive cost versus what the customer cost is borne to. So the main issue, I guess, that we are wrestling with is that we have a very aggressive weatherization program in place right now with a lot of federal money, and we are seeing that incentives for things like weatherization are at extremely high levels, levels that we would never have supported, but not for these federal funds. So, we're talking about upwards of 90%, 90% incentive costs for moderate income weatherization projects and 100% coverage for low income houses, and obviously that's the case for weatherization agencies today, and partly why it takes many years for us to see progress in that. So because of the availability of funding, I'll finish that thought. So on something like that, where the context of getting the market to move quickly, I mean, I saw a lot of those comments around like, oh well, the incentive cost is going to be a lot lower than what the total project cost is. But fundamentally, the clean heat standard is supposed to drive even more projects than what we're doing today. And so I'll wrap this up by just sort of saying we're already at 90% incentive cost for weatherization projects for a moderate income band. Now, maybe you can get away with paying a little bit less to a market rate, but that's already 150% AMI, getting what is essentially, or I guess 120% AMI under the current ARPA programs. I mean, how much lower can we really go and still expect that the clean heat standard actually drives incremental projects? And I guess at some point, do we have to make some assumptions that on projects, like you were talking about, Alec, you're basically asking people to rip the sidings off their house, get insulation installed. These are very invasive projects, not to be taken sort of lightly or on a whim. I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of questioning: is it reasonable for us to not consider the full project cost as sort of being the cost that we have to consider? And I realize that's probably a pretty provocative comment, but I just, given where we're at today, I guess I had to make it.
I mean, it's a good point. Sorry, Jared, you go ahead if you got. I just noticed your hand was up. Sorry.
Oh, and I think actually David may have been ahead of me. I actually have a different comment. So anybody who has comments on the point that Dave just brought up, I'm happy to step back.
Thanks,
I would just respond
David.
real quick. It's a perfectly valid point, and like I said before, I think a lot of this stuff we're trying to base it in the reality of current programs with the sort of business as usual cases, which I'll talk about in a second here with the scenarios. But we've got a couple of different buckets of different weatherization project types. As you said, there's like a market rate one. There's multifamily with with and without low income, different types of numbers of units. I think there's 5 or 6 different configurations we're looking at. yeah, for the most part, the incentive is quite rich across the board, even 100% in some cases. So um, it's a place where we don't have a lot of wiggle room to really pull that lever too hard.
Okay, I have comments from David Hill, then Jared, and then Ken Jones.
Thanks, Riley. I apologize for trying to turn the camera on. It asked me to kind of reboot the meeting platform software, et cetera. So I have not done that, but I'm behind the voice. I can verify that it's me talking. And so thank you everybody for doing this and joining. As was mentioned, EFG working with partners was involved in one of the original modeling study for the thermal sector. People are familiar, I think, probably with the work we did, and just a couple things to help. I think that the framing that's been discussed is very useful. I would note, without wanting to be overly technical, that say the model, if you would, that EFG was working with was an amalgam of the LEAP model along with 3 complementary workbook models that then also informed the analysis. So you have kind of spreadsheet models that are calculating outside of LEAP because there are certain things that the LEAP model wouldn't be doing. And that often depends on the perspective you're taking, kind of a societal perspective, economy-wide, versus an individual customer perspective versus, say, a program and administrative cost perspective. So I think these things can be, I appreciate and think it's very important and helpful to continue to refine the work that we've done to try to get a good view of the overall costs for Vermont and for Vermont consumers. Riley, you mentioned at the outset a number of different perspectives. So, there isn't just the one single, it's program participant, program non-participant, and all these things. With all of the variables and then the scenarios that we can get to, this becomes still, it will not be done in the 7 weeks, but it will be further along. And that's helpful. It's really useful. So I appreciate, the effort that will be going into this. I think the list of variables and then the discussion and comments from Dave are also very, very helpful. The staging of measure adoption and how that's related to the incentives, both that are being generated, within Vermont or outside of Vermont, continued federal incentives or not, et cetera, how those things play out are worth needing to look at sensitivities, because we won't have necessarily, we'll get some greater clarity as we move forward here, but we won't have full clarity on what that looks like. To reach the levels of adoption in the timeframes that we need to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act, it is going to require significant incentives. Now, where are those going to come from? But you're going to need to stay up at the high end of the incentives. And you need to account for the interactivity of measures being installed at the same time, all of those types of activities. The reality of being able to ramp at the rates that the model suggests. The model doesn't have a prescriptive answer. The model kind of tells you, okay, we need to be able to deliver services more quickly, perhaps, than we are. So that's, we can't treat the model as a revised model as well as an oracle, but it can help to inform. These are stress points that we're going to be seeing with the ability to deliver, the ability for customers to adopt the activities at the rate necessary. So I think that most of the the bottom up, I think market optimized, something where you have market optimized results. I appreciate the work that MV5 did, but I think using the information and updating assumptions and inputs based on information from the current implementation programs and the market activity that we can see is very valuable. We did the best we could when we were doing the analysis to document all that, make it transparent. It takes some effort, so continuing to work on that, I think, will be valuable. And appreciate everybody kind of participating and pitching into this process, but it's a large undertaking. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, David, for helping to manage expectations. Jared's next.
Thanks, Commissioner Allen. On the variables, I do have some comments that I want to be sure to be able to share later on the outputs, but I think we're still on the variables section of this slide. And I believe, Alec, you had said in terms of the questions around estimating the administrative costs, that one of the challenges there is the lack of a kind of fully implemented comparable program. And while I agree with that in terms of a clean heat standard in line with what Vermont is considering, I do think I wonder if it could be helpful in terms of getting an estimate around administrative costs to seek out information from the state of Oregon, which has been managing a clean fuels program, which is basically the same type of program. It's a performance standard, but applied to importers of fossil transportation fuels rather than importers of fossil heating fuels. And my understanding is that would likely, our program would likely operate very similarly to theirs. Certainly there would be some differences of measures that would be eligible here, that would not be relevant on the transportation side, for instance, wood heat or weatherization. But in terms of, looking at how to recognize, track, verify credits, especially related to, the obligations on fuel importers and in terms of clean fuels, that would seem to me to be a starting point that might be helpful in terms of estimating some of the administrative costs from as I see it, probably not a perfect parallel, but the closest parallel we're likely going to see.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And we've looked at that program. We've looked at the low carbon fuel standard program in California. We've looked at some of Maryland's projections, which obviously they don't have a program yet, but they've done some of this work too. So yeah, no, it's a good point. There are comparable setups that we have looked at for sort of proxy values. So yes, that thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, so Ken Jones.
Yeah, this is my question related to David Westman's observation and related to the NV5 study. We have existing programs that in the weatherization case has very high incentive payments. The NV5 analysis assumed that the costs of things like weatherization would be fully captured in the clean heat standard credit value. And that, I think, is a problem in that when we have existing programs such as weatherization, where those costs have already been, those incentives have already been paid for, then I don't believe it will be necessary to have another payment to take those credits and include them in the credit program. And the sort of parallel, but on the other side, is the literally tens of thousands of folks that have installed heat pumps at a fairly low incentive amount with, as my understanding, and I've asked the question to many people, no expectation from January 1st, 2023 to today that they're going to be receiving a payment from a clean heat standard credit. And so those existing and the extent to which whatever reason people are putting in heat pumps, if that can be maintained, then also there is no need to pay the very, very high project cost to ensure that they continue to happen. So, and this gets back to kind of a microeconomics 101 diagram, and it's the demand curve. And we are at a place with many of these installed measures where there is a zero cost from a clean heat standard for installing measures because they're happening now without the credit value in place. And yes, to get 100% adoption, you have to go way up the demand curve to that price where you're close to or at 100%. But to assume that all installations are going to require the 100% incentive payment is a violation of that economic principle. We can and should design these programs in such a way so that we work our way up the demand curve. We don't have to get everybody installed measures in year one, and therefore you design incentives to inch them along the demand curve and not assign all of the costs of a project to the clean heat standard. That will be a way to get the costs that were suggested in the NV5 report down a great deal. Now, it's not easy, but the nice thing about the clean heat standard is it does run for multiple years, and establishing a credit requirement in the early years that inches along the demand curve allows for that lower credit incentive payment, or lower credit costs, and therefore incentive payment. So that's a philosophy that I hope can be included in this modeling effort, and one that is quite different than some of the modeling efforts that have been carried out so far.
Okay, I appreciate those comments. I think they stimulate a lot of thoughts in my mind, but I don't want to spend too much time on that unless others want to kind of engage on it further. But Dave Westman is next. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Segue into, it seems like people want to talk about the scenario analysis more. I think that's quite kind of the meat of this discussion anyway. So that could be a good segue if we want to shift the discussion there.
Okay, let me just see if Dave and TJ want to kind of insert their comments while we're on the first category first, and then we can turn that over and back to you, Alec.
I'll be real quick, Riley. Thank you. Yeah, we can talk about the comments that Ken just raised in the context of those scenarios. I think that makes a lot of sense. I did just want to add another variable. Maybe it's already being considered in admin costs, but you've already addressed the issue of availability in the liquid fuels, and I just wanted to note that measure availability, such as workforce constraints with the ability to deploy weatherization. This is not a perfectly speaking of supply and demand curves, this is not an elastic supply curve. We do not have an infinite capacity to raise workforce commensurate with the demand. And so these things do take a long time to get vendors up to speed, contractors trained, programs launched. And so, this is not just as simple as, putting a dollar signal out there and then all of the workforce just sort of pivots in response. And so it will take an investment to raise that workforce again, slowly over time, which is why we need phased approaches, sure, but also consistent signals that if you build a business around providing a clean heat measure installation, that you can afford to meet payroll for years as a result.
Thank you, David. TJ?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to I thank you everybody for the feedback and the suggestions here, and I think it sounds like we're kind of on the right track with the types of variables that we might want to be stressing here as we go forward. I do want to take a step back for a second before we get into the scenarios and level set a little bit on, the Department of Public Service fully expects to file something with the Commission of what we think the range of costs for a clean heat standard might be. And all of this discussion, I think, is really useful for that. I am hopeful that others are also going to file something or with the commission that might talk about what they think that the range might be. And this discussion that we're having here would be useful to kind of narrow the types of things that we're discussing, maybe bound ranges in some instance. But what I'm worried about is this by the department in our role, as a state agency participating in here, the Energy Planning Office, we think it's, and the ratepayer advocate, we feel like it's important for us to contribute to that conversation, but I think it'll be a lot less helpful to the conversation if we're the only ones that put out a number and everybody's just shooting at the number. That's really a recipe for this to get really politicized really fast, as opposed to it being one of voices going forward. And I'm a little afraid that the conversation is because we are kind of suggesting the types of things here, the conversation is kind of, well, there's going to be a model that's going to give us the answer. And really, there's going to be a lot of different possibilities that the commission has to adjudicate and says, well, we think this is kind of a good bottom end of the range, and we think this is a good top end of the range, and put into its report. And I don't know if anybody else is thinking of, providing that type of analysis. Maybe our expectations are not correct, and it will just end up with there being one model to rule them all. I think that's dangerous, but that could be the way we go. And so I just wanted to put that note of caution out there. And then before I drop the floor here, or leave, I just want to temper expectations as well. Having like a graduated incentive level range from now until 2030, and then changing for the next 5 years and changing again. We only have 7 weeks here. I think we're hitting on the right one, but we could get to some really precise annual change here, but that's not going to be any more accurate than something that might be a little more general, and we're really looking to bound ranges. So I want to just also temper expectations about exactly what might come out of at least what we're going to do, so that I don't know. So I just want everybody to be at least roughly on the same page, and I'll stop talking now.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you're asking a very specific question. You're asking whether there are others that are going to pitch up, and if we know that today, I would, I'd certainly be interested. But I'm a little bit concerned about what we receive and how we can kind of process, multiple different models and convert that into something that represents a coherent estimate that we pass to the legislature. It seems to me we'd have to kind of have a very deep understanding of each of the models and their relative merits and demerits, and do some deep processing of our own, which may be appropriate if that's the way it kind of plays out. But another way to go is to essentially create a framework that allows, I think, much more public conversation at key points along the way into one model that is, that has essentially a relatively expert modeler that is kind of considering and incorporating and then documenting those, inputs to be passed along to the commission for us at the end of the day to receive and pass along, and maybe even make modifications to as we receive it at the end. But I'll open the floor to others that think they might want to be coming forward with a counter model. So I'm not hearing it now. Others can kind of provide comment. I'll invite comments from others after the workshop. Jared Duval, I prepared in writing a number of recommendations. Okay, thanks. TJ, do you have anything further you want to say on that before we go back to Alec?
Yeah, I just, I tried to put people on the spot here on purpose. Understandable that there's not any sort of immediate feedback, but the sooner that we know if folks are going to do that, the better, because it if the department chooses a path on one of these variables that bounds the range in a different way than someone agrees with, then it could really undermine the whole process. And recognizing that we are the public service department and an arm of the administration, and that is what I'm trying to avoid. And so, if nobody pitches up, then I think that speaks volumes on its own, and I would be pointing that out in any processes going forward.
Well, okay, I have things that I could say, but I want to hear from others. So Dave Westman and then Jared.
Thanks, Commissioner Allen, and TJ, thanks for the offer. I think everybody is aware that Efficiency Vermont conducts a very extensive modeling process alongside the department in the development of its potential study for efficiency measures. We were surprised when the potential study that was released by the department, the top 10 thermal measures, didn't include weatherization, which we thought was going to be a key component of the clean heat standard. So, to this extent, I think we're always willing to take a fresh look at what the weatherization and thermal efficiency costs would look like for our market. I think you can sort of plan for us to be dusting off the numbers that we had previously submitted to the commission a number of years ago in the Act 62 reports, but to undertake a full modeling exercise, I know this, TJ, but our model doesn't incorporate all of the clean heat standard measures, nor could we possibly endeavor to undertake that in the time frame that we have. We run a entirely ground up model from literally going measure by measure and resource capacity and market potential on up the chain. So that would not be an endeavor that we could do in the 7 weeks or even the 15 odd weeks before the legislative session.
Thanks, Dave. Jared?
Yeah, just in response to TJ's prompt, I wanted to offer, as a volunteer climate counselor, I don't have the resources to develop a standalone separate model. And I think that to my mind, it is less about having competing models than it is about having comfort with the inputs and assumptions of whatever model's chosen. And, I was very encouraged to hear, I believe it was from Alec, maybe it was from TJ, that going forward, there is a preference for using the kind of EFG plus the LEAP model plus the associated workbooks, because I do think it's really important that whatever model is used, for folks to have trust and confidence in it, that there be transparency around those inputs and assumptions and the ability to kind of see into the workbooks what values are being used. And so, and I think there were elements of the NV5 model that were more of a black box approach, where basic questions around some of those inputs and assumptions couldn't be answered. And so for me, I would say I think it's possible to get a range of draft results that would be credible, but it depends not on the model being used, but on the inputs and assumptions going into that model. So my concern isn't the model being chosen, but is the inputs and assumptions and the ability to have robust discussion about those so that they're as appropriate as possible.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. I think that's helped to kind of focus things, at least in my mind. I want to turn back to Alex so he can continue his framing of issues.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, onto the scenarios. I think we've already kind of we've already gotten here, so I'll just cut to the chase and give you sort of our basic idea of how we plan to build up, or I guess set the framework for scenario analysis. And our thought is basically, as I've alluded to already, and I think as others have suggested, we're taking the business as usual approach and creating building blocks out of that. So first and foremost, that gets kind of taken out of the potential going forward as it's already happening. But because it already represents the, quote unquote reality case, we feel that it's most appropriate to use that as sort of the basis to build up the additional sort of levels of effort required to get to the GWSA targets. And so, our plan is to basically create, again, toggles or sliders or some kind of, knobs that you can turn to increase or decrease each one of the sort of discrete building blocks based around current market activity. And so you can, I think the idea is that we would say, to David's earlier point about something like workforce constraint, you can say, okay, well, we know we can achieve this. So if we 2x effort or 3x effort, regardless of whether or not there's technically the bodies here to do that work, what does that look like from a cost perspective? What does that look like from an incentive perspective, et cetera, et cetera? And to at least know that rather than, again, having sort of theoretical thresholds around cost efficiency, that we're building this up from, individual projects, individual widgets, and individual gallons of fuel sold. And the idea is that you'd be able to, ramp those up, at least in the initial scenario, and then have liquid fuels in the proportion that they exist now kind of backfill the rest of the credit need as is appropriate based on how you build that up. The other piece of it, I think, is that, we have to address the equity component of it. And so there is a need to be able to toggle the low income portion of credits derived. And so that becomes another slider where it changes the measure mix in a way because it overemphasizes a certain subset of measures. But again, it just kind of distorts the whole model from those business as usual building blocks, and then again, backfills with liquid fuels. And then within that, you can utilize those scenarios to do sort of the sensitivity analysis that was alluded to earlier by changing other parameters in the variables section, where you change the administrative cost because you think it could be up to a certain level, or it could be down to a certain level, or because the program has, because the activity has a certain effect on liquid fuel markets out of state, maybe there's an impact on price, or another state, decides to adopt a similar policy, and demand goes way up. What are the different ratchets you could put on fuel prices as a result of that? Again, within the availability thresholds. So that's our basic premise of this, is to create sort of those general sliders that can ratchet up those building blocks, and the associated savings and costs contained within the measure characterizations, and then administrative cost, liquid fuel price, and availability. Those are sort of adders that all get factored in on the outside. I don't know if I've explained that super clearly, but that's the basic idea. So people want to weigh in with additional scenarios or need, clarity on that explanation, have that.
Okay, the floor is open for comments or requests for clarification. In terms of this process, Alec or TJ, how do you see, essentially what you're proposing, interfacing with, like Jared's comment about, agreement on the inputs and assumptions, or, potentially the scenarios, how would you kind of like to see this process, dovetail with the work that you're doing or proposing to do.
I don't know if you have any particular thoughts, TJ, but if the more forthright and prompt people can be with what they'd like to see as scenarios, up until a certain point, I'm happy to try to build those things from at least a mechanical standpoint into the model. I would also go as far, and I don't know how proficient or comfortable everyone is with Excel, but we could make the user interface, tab available as well if people want to set their own scenarios up. I'm comfortable with that. I don't know if David Hill is probably wincing in pain right now, but I'd like to try to be as flexible as possible, at least given the time constraint, to allow people to weigh in. How they choose to do that, I think, is, if you'd rather do it on your own or propose things, we can try to be accommodating. But again, we're still, we're building this thing in real time, and there's not a lot of time left. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I again want to just raise a note of caution, I guess, on what will be possible. I think, we feedback on, are these the right variables? Are these the right types of scenarios is really important. Feedback on what, the ranges, the bound of ranges should be for incentive levels, or how we should treat that. There may be instances where we can simply adopt a recommendation that we got and everything is great. There may be other times where we say, well, that's, liquid fuels may not be available in, this quantity. And, our response may be, well, that's kind of captured by the price variable. And, if they're not available, the price goes up, and we're kind of using that general assumption to capture that issue. And there may be other instances where we, as a department, simply don't agree. An example I could say is if we are assuming 100% of all of the costs for obligated parties are going to be amortized over the lifetime of the measures. And there's different opinions on that, and magnitude, and maybe there's a slider that could be built, but I just I'm cautious about over-committing to a model that responding to precise recommendations that would maybe not actually be able to be incorporated in the manner that the commenter would like. So all that's to say is I agree completely with Alec that we want to be as open and transparent as possible in what we're doing. Time is short, so as soon as we could get feedback, it would be great to talk about kind of ranges of incentive levels.
Well, it might be helpful to actually see what the department is proposing before people can kind of make a counter proposal or a counter bid.
Yeah, again, though, I'm cautious about, this is, we're proposing to make recommendations to the commission so that the commission can adjudicate like disagreements. It's really easy to sit with a pea shooter and shoot peas at a target, and so I'd like folks to put their thoughts on the table at the same time. And if I feel like the people who are engaged in this proceeding should be able to do that, and it sounds like they are actually. I mean, Jared, in the comments you put that you have recommendations. That's great. I would love to look at those. We may or may not agree. I suspect we'll agree with a lot of them and may not agree with some of them. I don't know. That's usually how things go. But we would be able to have a answer for that where we didn't agree, or a reason why, and then we can just go from there, and everything would be transparent. The last thing I'll say about having a model out there, I actually am very concerned about having a public model, a draft public model out there. We all saw what happened when we had the draft of the potential study out there this summer, and it really got taken out of context. And so that really concerns me as well. And I don't know what the right answer is for that, but I don't want to seem obstructionist here, but I just want to raise flags of caution on kind of the implications of what we're trying to do and what might happen here.
Okay, well, I mean, from my standpoint, I'm trying to help, and I'm trying to kind of, recognize and respect, the very valid and good concerns that you're raising. But also, I'm sensing a lot of, interest in kind of helping out and at least providing, inputs, other assumptions that might be helpful, and to play our role of either facilitating or asking parties to kind of work directly with you. And I don't want to overwhelm you and Alec and the department, so I'm kind of asking you to tell me how can we be helpful. Aaron wants to say something too.
Yeah, I was wondering if it might be helpful or possible for the department to put out sort of a skeleton of these are the kinds of things that are involved. These are the things that are going to be involved, so that people have a framework to use to do their comments without actually having a draft model. Is there an intermediate space we can get to where people have something to touch, but it's not enough to take out of context?
Possibly. I mean, I think we could say things, Alec, correct me if I'm wrong here. We could say things like, here's what we're assuming for a low and a high end of range for incentive levels.
Yeah, I think what I can do is just take this slide here, and under each one of these categories, just put sort of the high-low parameters on it. And some of them are more qualitative than others, so I'd have to get a little bit more prosy. But would that be helpful? Is that kind of what you're getting at, or are you hoping for more like quantitative, like a set of numbers or something like that? Could you clarify?
I am looking for a set of variables, not a set of numbers, but a set of like variable names, because I think that would help people think about the things they can adjust.
Yeah, for example, incentive levels, we'd say, I mean, then maybe that's a bad example, 0 to 100% or something like that. Or liquid fuels availability or price, current price less 30% plus 200%. I'm just making this up now, but is that more in line with what you're thinking?
It's in line with what I'm thinking. I would like to know if that's helpful to others, because if it's not, there's no point in you doing the exercise.
Jared wants to jump in, so I'll let him speak.
You're muted, Jared.
I guess not.
Thanks. Sorry, yeah, just as one, person participating in this, I would be happy to review and respond to kind of list of inputs, assumptions, variables, and kind of ranges. And also happy to provide, as TJ suggested, some thoughts up front rather than just in reaction. One of the thoughts that I had not written down, but I will add to what I submit and will share here, that I think is especially relevant if the main modeling basis that the PSD is going to build from, and that many folks here will be responding to, is that the latest LEAP model that I'm aware of, that the kind of state has maintained, there are significant discrepancies between that model and the estimated statewide greenhouse gas emissions for every year between 2015 and 2021, for which there are statewide emissions estimates in the greenhouse gas inventory, in which there are estimates in the Vermont Pathways LEAP model. And so, I'm going to be really consistent on this. I think we always have to start with the law, and the Global Warming Solutions Act makes really clear that the measure of compliance is with regard to the official state inventory. And so, I provided some comments on the NV5 model about aligning the emissions numbers and emissions trajectories in line with the Solutions Act and then the Climate Council's interpretation of that. I would note that my understanding is that the LEAP model has not yet been corrected or revised to address a very consistent and significant discrepancy between emissions levels as reported in the inventory versus what's being estimated in LEAP. My recollection is that most of that discrepancy is actually in the transportation sector, but I believe there has also been some discrepancy in the thermal or residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector that would need to get addressed, in order to have confidence on the back end that things are going to end up tying back to the inventory in the GWSA.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think I'm not sure if I apologize if I didn't make this clear earlier. We're actually not relying on the LEAP model for our measure level inputs. We are taking program actuals from, as I said, OEO weatherization, all the EEUs through their energy efficiency, electric and TPF programs. We've got a whole bunch of data from all the DUs. And that's what the basis for the measure, the measure participation levels is. And then we're using the same carbon intensity scores from the NV5 study, which is the latest state data. So I think that concern should be assuaged, but I'm not sure if that was helpful.
Go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, I appreciate that program actuals are being used. I think that is a good approach. My concern is about, in terms of the scale and the kind of pace of reduction, what that is being pegged to. And I think that we have to align those activity levels, those program actuals, with reported emissions, and then figure out what is the differential, what is the delta in terms of the additional activity that would need to happen to meet the thermal sector's proportion, to meet the GWSA targets as measured in the inventory. Because if the program actuals aren't synced to those emissions, then what are we aiming towards in terms of compliance? That's my concern.
I guess I'm confused then. If we're using latest carbon intensity scores and program actuals pegged to MMBTU savings, shouldn't that just multiply out to, is that the best accounting we can get, or I'm confused?
I mean, the inventory is based, at least in the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use sector, it's primarily based on fossil heating fuel sales as reported by the tax department. So it's not based on, number of weatherizations, number of heat pumps installed. It's the amount of fossil heating fuel sales and the associated emissions with them. And so, to me, there's got to be a tie back to what a certain level of fuel use associates with a certain number of emissions. And then if we have an emissions reduction target and therefore need to get a certain amount of fuel use, that has to, in my mind, be tied to the kind of adoption curves or the measure targets.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think we address that so it's those business as usual, again, building blocks or whatever you want to call them. Those are being run straight through carbon intensity scores, the latest numbers from ANR, and those are being used in the block sense to build up to the GWSA target. So again, different scenarios, getting all the way to the target with with business as usual in a ramp up, that may look different depending on what kind of thresholds we set. So we could say, give us 4x business as usual, and then we'll backfill the rest with liquid fuel sales. And our plan there is just to use the proportionality of existing liquid fuel sales. But I don't have these numbers handy, but it's 40% number two, and it's 15% natural gas, or I'm making that up, but whatever that proportion is, we'll layer that across the remaining credits that need to be derived at those carbon intensity scores, and that will back into whatever the total number is that was identified as the GWSA target. And those again those numbers come out of the ultimate targets come out of the NV5 potential study.
Right. So to make sure I'm on the same page with you, Alec, and to just reiterate for everybody, we're, inventory is where we're at using the tax data. Going forward, like 2024 on, or if we have to do 22 and 23, I don't think we do, because I think there's enough tax data. So inventory goes through 2023, and then we have measures going forward, and that reduces carbon relative to inventory, and targets are, the proportionality as we ended up with in the NV5 study and the potential study, which I think is the right set of targets through to 2029. So.
There's a break from inventory to modeled targets.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, TJ, did you want to say something further? Tristan's going to come in after you speak.
I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. Tristan?
So the question about incentive levels and whether it's helpful to show that as a range, I'd say it's definitely worth the time in this situation. You're kind of facing a policy modeler's worst nightmare, that you've got 7 weeks to generate an output, and in 3 weeks we have a major policy inflection point, right? With the election, the federal incentive levels, right? I don't think anyone knows which way they're going to go, but the reality is many of these incentives that are going to affect the CHS do start to sunset in 2025. In many cases, there's an assumption, maybe they'll be extended, but I don't think anyone knows at this point. And so in terms of keeping the outputs from the model relevant, as we move into the new year, if you have a range of incentive levels, that really helps people identify, okay, depending on which way things are trending, here's what you're most likely to see.
Thanks, Tristan. Anyone else? David Hill.
Excuse me. Another point, Dave Westman talked about the need for providers or those looking to create clean heat standards to have some certainty around them, their ability to invest, to develop the capacity and infrastructure to be able to deliver. The costs for the fuels and the impact of the costs on those fuels would be dependent, and we discussed this some in the EFG report, on the ability to amortize those costs over a time period. And so that's something that will need to be structurally considered, whether those are financed or whether those costs then hit in an initial years.
Yeah, but we've had some discussion of that internally. I don't know that we've come to a concrete decision on that. I guess we're kind of torn between, the accuracy and ease of use, I guess, for lack of a better way to put that. And I take your point, David, and I'm not sure. I feel like it's going to take us a lot of time to calibrate that level of an interactive effect. And so I'm still on the fence about this. I could be convinced either way, I think, but we're trying to get at some of that just by using the fuel price, sort of min max threshold sliders, and just trying to get at that, at least in conceptually, through that variable.
Okay, David Westman. You might be on mute, David.
No, you muted.
Got it. Thanks. My microphone is unmuted, but the screen is disassociated for some reason in this meeting. Thank you. My question is about the potential study that was not released with the, the program achievable results that were not released with the potential study released earlier this summer. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is directly or indirectly related to, why the potential study needed that program achievable result. And I'm just wondering, I wasn't on those calls. I'm not sure where or in what capacity that was discussed, but could the department maybe address why that potential study didn't include, that all together critical program achievable result? Because I think that ultimately, like, that's kind of what we're all talking about here. And maybe they just didn't have the tools or the resources to do it. But I think that would be helpful to understand.
EJ, do you have?
I'll take this one
backstory on
since
the
it'd be unfair to Alex since he started in August. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it boils down to that the time and resources available to do what amounted to an implementation plan, and kind of get drilled down to, I think, a lot of these questions that we're talking about here and coming up with a solution. I tend to agree, in an ideal world, we in September would have had a program implementation plan or a program achievable potential that would have had cost information then, several months ago. That obviously didn't happen, and we're kind of working now to create the structure to do that. I think it also speaks a little bit to the structure of NV5's model, of being kind of an optimization model, and the need in kind of the program potential to then force unit counts into that model. And it wasn't I think it probably would have been doable, but it wasn't clean, and it was a time and resources consideration.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. And just to build on my earlier comment, for everyone else on the call and their benefit, we would usually work very closely with the department on a potential study result with program achievable results, and then really get into the weeds with them on what TJ just referred to as total number of measures. Getting into those weeds is a complicated, sometimes weeks or months long process. That's why it would be helpful here. But I think what we're sort of talking about is how can we build that program achievable result with some satisfaction. But that's at least helpful context.
Yeah, and I think we're talking about like different scenarios
Sure.
for potential measure mixes that might be implemented. I will also note, that where you reference the potential studies we do for electric efficiency, we do a potential study, and then the implementation plan is in the demand resources proceeding, which is where we ultimately decide the budget. And the implementation plan, while informed by the potential study, is often different, much different than the potential study. So for what it's worth, I don't know if that's worth anything, but.
No, I think for everyone's benefit, that is helpful context, because that potential study is developed, essentially on a parallel track as we are developing our DRP. Sometimes we see eye to eye with the department on, what a measure's potential is in the state and what it costs, and that's generally the case, for 90 to 95% of what's in the DRP and what we plan to go out and achieve. Sometimes there have been some sort of notable disagreements that can get resolved, or the risks ameliorated. In effect, that sort of becomes a major element of efficiency planning, in effect. And longer term, it would be great if the clean heat standard, had that level of rigor to a potential plan. I guess we're just in the early steps of that at this point, whereas the efficiency process is quite mature.
Okay, thank you, David. So TJ, I just want to kind of be clear on what would be kind of efficient steps. I'm trying to figure out if the commission needs to just get out of the way, or if we can aid you in facilitating what sounds like we have willing partners that are willing to step forward and provide, their suggestions for input, assumptions, and their guidance. And we could facilitate something that's, with your assistance, we could kind of identify the variables and the kind of specific detailed categories or subvariables, and ask for kind of guidance and see what comes forward. And then it would be up to either you or potentially us to essentially triage or use those to either accept a recommendation, to use that recommendation to help create a range, or to reject and give reasons why the suggestion is not appropriate. But that path, in my mind, takes it away from what you're most concerned about, which is you all putting out a model, and the model being taken out of context, and people taking their pea shooters and shooting down all the variables. Is there a way of accomplishing? And I think this is really kind of, it gets back to Aaron's point, identifying the variables and allowing the partners to contribute where they can. And my question is that something that can happen without the commission, or is that something where the commission should be stepping in, helping to facilitate that?
My personal preference would be if the commission could help facilitate that. I think one thing I'm a little bit hesitant to try to engage in a process of sort of modeling by consensus. I think that we just don't have the time or resources to do that. But that said, I would still reiterate my earlier point that we want to be as collaborative and transparent as possible. And so I think, I would prefer if the commission could sort of be the, do arbitration there, or just at least be some sort of filter.
Okay, we don't have to decide this here, but I do, we're able and willing, but efficiency is really important here, and I don't, want to risk kind of gumming things up unnecessarily. TJ?
Well, I was going to suggest a process, and this is on the fly. So, Alec, let me know if these timelines don't sound right to you, and apologize for that. But one, people see the variables and scenarios and the outputs on the slide here, right? If organizations or participants want to provide comments to the commission through the process, we will automatically get notified when they're filed, but you could also send them to us. And that would allow us to kind of consider that in what we're going to try and develop for these ranges of incentives. We heard some of them here actually today already, which I think has been helpful. What Tristan, you just mentioned about the tax credits potentially going away was not something that was on my radar. But once those are filed, then perhaps having another workshop in a couple of weeks, because I do see value in this kind of this part of it being public. Maybe 2 to 3 weeks. I don't know where that lands us, but to say where we would maybe a couple of days prior to that share where we, like what Aaron had suggested in terms of here's our narrative of where we think the range for incentive levels might land. Here's our narrative on administrative costs range. And then have a workshop. And, I'm more comfortable about talking about that in the context of it being, for discussion at this point is still, and not having numbers associated with it yet. And we could talk about it and talk about the reasons for those things and then go from there. What's missing, what's not, why we didn't include something, etc. I'm going to look at Alec right now to see if that sounds not doable to you either. If you all haven't realized that Alec's doing a lot of the actually heavy lifting here.
I mean, I think that sounds reasonable. I don't want to commit to anything too specific, but I think that sounds like a reasonable process.
Post that workshop, I'm not exactly how to structure it to get to your, early December deadline. Perhaps, I don't know if there needs to be another round of some sort of comments, or we just file something in December and others as well file something post workshop.
But I'm happy to schedule a workshop in 3 weeks to kind of anticipate, kind of a, further distillation of, the comments and guidance that has been provided on these variables, scenarios, and outputs. I do wonder if there's enough specificity in these things you've laid out here. I mean, incentive levels, it seems to me that that's going to be vary by measure and, fuel type and other things. And so we might have to kind of get a little more granular in kind of what we're calling out and asking for. I think this is potentially a conversation where we might just have to take it offline a little bit and just plan on the commission kind of putting something out, receiving input and guidance, and we're going to endeavor to kind of frame things as clearly and well as we can, so that it provides the kind of inputs that the department and ultimately the commission can kind of react to over time. But anticipate a workshop roughly 3 weeks from today to do some further milling of what it is that we receive. But we probably want to receive some input in a week or 10 days and go from there.
Riley, did you see that Ken Jones has his hand up?
Oh, no, I didn't. I missed that. Sorry, Ken.
And I I need to go back a little bit here because I appreciate this discussion, and I think I understand the results of the model with regards to the costs for implementing installed measures, the costs for delivering lower carbon fuels, and its resulting impact on fuel prices. But, and then this, I guess, is a question for you, Riley, and maybe I should know, but is the economic analysis also going to include changes to income patterns? In other words, the work that is accomplished through these installations, and maybe some changes in terms of the fuel delivery and its impact on employment patterns and income. Is that also a part of this economic analysis? And if so, does the result of the model get you enough to get you there?
So it's my intent, you know, I've been trying to manage my own kind of ambitions in this effort. To my mind, Ken, I've been thinking about it in kind of two stages. If we can get what I call sectoral impacts, so the impacts within, you know, essentially the energy sector, well framed, I think they provide valuable inputs toward the broader kind of economy-wide economic impacts that we might want to kind of infuse in a implant or an REMI or you know, any Redyne or any of those other broader models. But at this point, those estimates aren't required in the legislation. Those are kind of the want-to-haves, not have-to-haves. The legislation requires us to provide what I had articulated earlier, which I think of as largely the sectoral impacts on price levels, you know, for fuels and for regulated fuels, and you know, for bills and program costs, and estimated on the high, mid, and low level. Is that responsive, Ken?
Yeah, it is. Thanks.
So, just to round that out, I'd like to have, you know, a solid foundation that would allow either us in the future or the legislature in the future to essentially do those broader looks at the impacts on the economy. Okay. Well, you know, we're coming, I think, near the end. I'm not sure what we scheduled for the end. I feel like, you know, we can talk about, you know, transparency in modules. We've talked a little bit about outcomes. The dashboard, I think, is an interesting concept, and, you know, having toggles and sliders and creating a framework that is both more transparent and accessible is, you know, something that, you know, the department or the commission certainly wants to pursue, and we've, you know, we're retaining Opinion Dynamics to kind of lend assistance on that front. And I think we have some semblance of, you know, kind of a next steps in the process. I think I'll kind of reach out to the department and work online to help the frame and ask of the parties to provide, you know, guidance on, you know, the inputs and the scenarios and the outputs. And I'll schedule a workshop for essentially further milling of that work. I think what I've heard is that, you know, the department's approach of relying on, you know, the more bottom-up approach, the, you know, EFG model that has been used in the past. I think that's well received. So I don't think the model is so much the issue. It's the, as Jared has pointed out, it's the, you know, the assumptions that go into that model that we really want to, you know, get straight on. And in my mind, there is a sensible process that the commission can help facilitate that allows us to, I think of it as triage those variables. So decide, you know, where to kind of yield and just kind of take assumptions, where to identify a reasonable range based upon the input, and where to essentially reject, but provide reasons for choosing something different than something that's being recommended. And I think that's kind of a sensible next step. Is there anything else that people want to talk about? Alec, Jared.
I have a logistical question and then also just a broader piece of feedback based on the discussion today and some of the prompts. The logistical piece is for those of us who want to submit material. TJ, I heard you say that we can just send it directly to you and Alec at the PSD, but for the PUC, I have no experience participating in PUC proceedings. I am just participating in this as in my volunteer capacity as a member of the Climate Council. So any guidance on who to file, how to file in terms of keywords, on what timeline, and I imagine that might be helpful to others, just so proper procedure is being followed about, when that's due.
In a couple days, I'll issue some sort of a scheduling order, and I'll try to be as clear as possible on what and how to file with the commission. And if for some reason we decide that that's not the best and most efficient route to go, I'll try to explain why and the procedural order. But I appreciate the heads up, and I'll do my best to ensure that there's clarity on where to file whatever needs to be filed. But I do want to kind of collaborate with the department on the path, the details of the path forward here. I'm not against your filing with the department. I'm really just trying to not overwhelm them and to be fair to the both transparency of the process and to them, so that we can help them where they need help, but also potentially provide some measure of order and transparency to the process.
Thank you. Is it okay to share the other reflection?
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So I've heard a number of times today, whether it's societal, customer, or program, and I think that this particularly applies to conversations around societal and customers, discussion about just the costs. And I know that I may sound like a broken record on this to many folks, but I think it's vitally important that whenever we're discussing societal analysis, we are looking at the costs and the benefits, including on the benefits side, potential savings, and that whenever we're talking about the customer side, we're looking at costs and savings. And I believe that that is what is intended in Act 18. And I'll just lift up one specific example of a concern that I have, that the conversation could focus exclusively on costs rather than on the benefits and savings side, depending on whether the lens is societal or customers. I think on the output slide that was up, Alec, you had shared as an output price per gallon increase, potential effect on fossil fuels. And in my mind, the way that the clean heat standard would operate is in a revenue neutral fashion, and that any potential increase on the fossil fuel side would happen as a result of obligated parties, importers of fossil heating fuels, passing their compliance cost onto their customers. But B, it would be to raise the funds necessary to incentivize and lower the costs of the clean heat options, whether that's equipment incentives or lower costs for clean heating fuels, to meet the clean heat credit obligations to reduce emissions over that time frame. And so I just want to make sure that if we're going to be talking about potential price effects on the fossil side, that we look at the potential price effects on the cleaner heating side. Let me just give an example of this. In Oregon, when they implemented their Clean Fuel Standard program, they saw 5, 6, 7 cents a gallon increase per gallon of diesel. At the same time, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it was something like $1.16 per gallon decrease on B100 biodiesel, and something like a 60 some odd cent decrease on the price of biodiesel made from soybeans. And so my concern is that much of the public conversation about a clean heat standard is being focused around only one part of one side of the equation, and that's potential upward price pressure on the fossil side, without being balanced by a discussion and an understanding that any increase on the fossil side is going to decrease costs for consumers on the clean side, including anticipated increased equipment incentives and decreased prices for cleaner fuels. And I worry that right now, if we have an output of the model as just what's going to happen on the prices of fossil heating fuels, rather than what are the anticipated price decreases on cleaner fuels, or the anticipated higher incentives beyond what they are now for some of this equipment, it's presenting a really limited and narrow understanding, both societally and from a customer perspective, in that it's not just a cost conversation, it's also about savings and benefits. And we need to be looking at both.
Okay, so Tom Nauer just posted something in the chat that lays out what is required in the law, and Alec wants to respond as well.
Yeah, I take your point, Jerry, but I also would caution that there's another, there's sort of an X factor in all of this, and that's the combination of installed measures with the liquid fuels, and the credits are meant to operate in the same market, at least currently as designed. And there is it varies across measures, but it's something like a factor of between 6 and 15 times cost increase between the average credit derived from low carbon intensity fuels and the average credit derived from installed measures. And I think one of the things that I've been struggling with in this model is how to reconcile that if you have one credit price, and if it's meant to be revenue neutral, which I would agree with you is the premise, overcoming that discrepancy is an added challenge that I just have not come up with a way to, it's dwarfing any relevant sort of downward pressure, or I guess, market incentive to increase supply on lower carbon intensity fuels. And I just don't really know how to model that, but it's a significant impact.
Yeah. If it's okay, I would just offer that I agree with the challenge that you're outlining. And I see that Tom Nauer has put in the chat the language from Act 18. And just to be specific, when we talk about impacts to customer rates and fuel bills, I read that as electricity rates. EFG did attempt to look at the downward price pressure on electric rates from broader, from fixed costs being spread out over a broader base of use. Fuel bills also include what people are paying for wood heat, and so I just want to make sure that we're looking at the language in the law. I think a lot of times we think fuel bills and we automatically think fuel oil or propane, but that's, about 70% of the heating in Vermont. Vermonters are also heating with electricity. We're also heating with wood. And then the participating and non-participating customers, I take to mean participating or not participating in clean heat measures, which could include weatherization, heat pumps, advanced wood heating, biofuels. And so that's where my comment is coming from, of looking at the anticipated customer effects for those participants who are benefiting from those lower cost cleaner fuels and those increased incentives for clean heat measures. So I do think that is captured in what the law is asking for in the language right there.
Okay, thank you, Jared. Luce?
Hi, thank you. And I know the law, we deal with residential, the impact on residential, but I do just want to say that there will be an impact on school districts, municipal buildings, our state university system, our hospitals. If the fuel cost goes up, it will affect all Vermonters. As we know, there's a lot of property tax issues right now and healthcare costs. So I don't know how we address that because I know this bill is really for residential, but it will definitely affect a lot of the cost to our state and our citizens. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luce. Any other comments? Okay, well, I think we've covered as much as I want to cover in this workshop today. We have, kind of a tentative plan going forward. Hopefully shortly you'll have something out from me that, nails us down a little more clearly and, sets out an ask and identifies a date for a next workshop that will follow up, and I'll probably be working a little bit with the department offline to help us to kind of frame clearly the ask or the input and where to essentially direct that input going forward. So does anybody else have any other concluding thoughts? Okay, with that, I'll end the session. Thanks very much for all the helpful input.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.